Welcome back, everyone. I see that some people are still continuing their lunch discussion. That's really great. That means that this morning session gave you a lot of thoughts to actually discuss with your partners. Thank you very much for being back here. So just before we start off the session, really the idea about this afternoon session is to move towards actual recommendations and an actual discussion on all the theoretical aspects we discussed this morning. We had a very good presentation from Arthur. Thank you very much, Arthur, for this presentation that gave us what is really the state of the art regarding scalability today. And we had this feedback and these testimonies from our workshop panelists. So now we are moving on to a more active phase where we are going to ask your feedback, and we are going to have this presentation from Peter, who is going to give us a very clear view about what it takes to create a blockchain infrastructure and one that actually scales large-scale blockchain applications. Before I start, I just want to highlight some questions that were asked by some of you here in the room. As you have seen, we have a panel over there where people can actually write down questions, and some of them are very interesting. Actually, here, all these questions are more questions and ideas that we are going to discuss during the working session, so I won't be covering them right now, but I think that there is an interesting question here. Is there a need for public funding in blockchain research space? And I think that this morning with Arthur, so I see that you all have a very straightforward opinion about that. This is great. But we discussed a lot about the research that has been done by Arthur, and actually we were discussing that right before, and thinking about elements of scalability and interoperability is a very long process that can take multiple months, multiple years for large teams. So maybe, Arthur, if you want to just quickly answer these really interesting questions we have here, that would be a pleasure.
Sure. So, like, also coming back to this morning, actually, at the question of what about DAGs, right? Are they interesting? Can we use DAGs? And I think here academics could help you to understand this. So, how long do I need to wait in a DAG for a transaction to confirm in order to have the same security as, for example, I don't know, 6 Bitcoin block confirmations? Right? Simple question, but this will take someone at least 6 months to come up with an answer. It's complicated.
So yeah, the answer would be yes then. And really more the actions could be something that we discussed after that. But so let's start the afternoon sessions. To start off, Ken is going to give us a little more context about what we are trying to achieve this afternoon and how we are going to do that. Thank you very much.
Thanks for staying. During this morning, we talked about the state of the art. Right? So we wanted to have as comprehensive an understanding as possible regarding the state of the research when it comes to scalability, interoperability, and sustainability. So we've talked about the state of the art, but now we need to look ahead. And what is our job? Our job is to define what would a European blockchain infrastructure look like. It's as simple as that. If public services or companies performing public services are going to use the blockchain, they need to be clear as to the requirements of the infrastructure that they're going to use. And so it's our job, right? So the taxpayers, the politicians, the civil servants are counting on you to define what it would take to create a public blockchain infrastructure, and that will be the outcome of today's workshops. To start with, we're going to hear from Peter Broadhurst from Kaleido, who will tell us about his project, and more importantly, his views as to, in his experience, what it takes to develop blockchain infrastructures that are used by many parties in the private or public sector. And then we'll have breakouts where we look at individual components of that architecture and try to formulate clear recommendations. The recommendations that you come up with will be summarized in the form of a thematic report, which will be published by the EU Blockchain Observatory and will, as with most public reports, be read by thousands and thousands of people throughout the European Union. So we are counting on you. Peter?
So, after a morning of thinking about the art of the possible, thinking about the state of the art, I guess I'm here to bring us back down to reality and talk from a very practical engineer's perspective. What are we seeing with our perspective of seeing lots of enterprise consortia forming as the patterns that breed success? The things which are achieving traction. I'm very lucky to have people who are achieving traction here in the room. So the idea is just to spend a reasonably short time, maybe 25 minutes on the slides, and then have a discussion about some of the thoughts here. And I've tried very hard to really just talk from observation of what we've actually seen fed back from the people that we've been talking to. And it is an exciting time as we come into 2019. There's going to be a number of permissioned enterprise-grade consortia that are moving to some form of real production. Now, whether in traditional terms that would be called pilot or production, and how close to meaningful high transaction volume systems they are, is open to observation. We'll see where we get to. But what is clear is that these are significant entities that have got together, and they've chosen to do something very significant, and they've put a lot of investment, they've put a lot of time, they've put a lot of resource into collaborating on solutions. And what I'd like to talk through is maybe some of the patterns of that collaboration, and then the technology that supports that collaboration, and to make these projects truly decentralized, because that's the goal here. The goal is not to use blockchain. The goal is to move from centralized systems to some form of decentralization that has a positive influence on economies, on the way people do business, and on the inclusivity of our societies. So there are some interesting patterns as you look through the names on here. There's a lot of solutions which are about post-trade activities. Not surprising, either post-trade in finance, stocks or securities, post-trade in the supply chain sector. Those are the top two sort of use cases that we see on the list being practically implemented today. No surprises there. What I would say is that there's a long tail of very interesting other examples. You know, people come across our desk all the time with very novel and interesting ideas. Lots in the gaming industry, not surprisingly, some in the betting industry, some actually looking at data sovereignty and ownership and sharing of data, healthcare. There's a fantastic sort of long tail of really interesting and novel, real deployments that we're seeing coming through. But the headline ones really are these core sort of post-trade environments. The other interesting pattern is the types of consortia that are forming. We're seeing genuine industries coming together to say, gosh, we better get together as a consortium now, because there's only going to be one consortium in this space for this particular industry in this particular geography. We better make sure that we're part of it. That's one type. Other types are, here's a large particular individual organization. You can guess sort of which ones you might be thinking of from the list here, that maybe you're looking at reconciling their internal supply chain and creating a sort of network around a single entity. And then there's the ones that luckily we have represented here today, which is saying, look, the platform needs to be there so that the innovation can happen. Let's build the foundation and allow the ideas to come. And I think that that's where this European project is really, really focused. So Consensus has put together a framework that is sort of a set of patterns of what we've seen be successful in previous projects. The rest of the presentation, I'm going to talk through some of my own experience of what fits into these categories. But you see at the bottom that actually the foundation is not a technology one. The foundation is around what is the business purpose, the legal framework, the meaning of the decentralization that the project is trying to achieve. And if you don't get that right, and that there's not a clarity of purpose there, it will fail. That's the only thing that's certain. The rest, there's flexibility, but if there's not the clarity of purpose, then the difficulty of this will outweigh the benefits, and it won't turn into something. Once you've got past that purpose, you've got that vision, then actually a lot of it is about pervading that vision through the team, the members, the participants in that consortium, getting to the point that you have a shared set of practices and goals. And we'll talk in some really meaningful detail about what that means. You then get to some of the technical aspects, which is that this thing's going to evolve. It's going to evolve very quickly. It's going to have lots of components. We'll talk about that later. And actually, you need to think about which of those components are shared, which of them are individually managed, which of them can we count on for the next 6 months, which of them can we count on for the next 3 months, maybe even there's some we can count on for the next year, but pretty much guaranteed some of those components are going to change. So thinking about abstracting away interfaces so that they can be swapped in and changed and evolved. That sort of service-oriented architecture, not an Alamo term I know from my integration background, but actually that really is important here. Taking pragmatic approaches to interoperability, considering that any glue is a point of friction to move forwards. Equally, operating completely in a bubble will make the solution meaningless. So finding ways to connect what's being done in meaningful ways to other things that are being done without slowing down the project. So that's how interoperability we're seeing being seen in the real world projects going forwards. Very interestingly, and here's a point I'm sure there'll be some questions on later, we're actually seeing that in these enterprise permissioned environments, and I guess that's the background I'm talking from here, we're actually seeing homogeneous environments. We're not seeing there's just a standard out there, bring any implementation you like. We're seeing consistency being driven through the consortium, particularly in the validating set of the technology stack that's being used. And I'll talk about why that might be as we go through. And we're also saying that if you don't have a centralized base of skill that all of the members of the consortium can call upon, usually with some kind of shared funding system to create that entity, to pool that skill, it's incredibly hard because everything is new to the enterprises that are running the individual environments. And if there isn't that shared pool of skill to call on, then again, it's a real reason that these things can fail. And that means you do need governance. It's really odd now to be in a space, and having been in a technology space for so many years where governance was a dirty word because it slowed everything down, suddenly I'm in a world where governance is one of the things that can actually speed things up. And that's a very interesting space to be in now. So let's talk about that governance, and let's talk about what a permissioned or private chain really means. It means identity. It means identity. Now, actually, the most important thing to think about as you're laying down a technology foundation for the technology to run a decentralized consortium is how are you going to establish that identity, and what are the various identities that are going to participate? Not everybody is going to be a validator. We talked about the consensus algorithms getting to the sort of throughputs that people are needing. We're talking like the 30-50 range is the suitable range for the technologies that they exist today to just go really easily at pilot stage. You may have many more participants than that. You certainly will have a desire to grow to many more participants than that. So you need to think about what are the participation levels inside of the consortium. How does somebody establish their right to reach that level? And very, very importantly, if you want this to be decentralized, it can't be, if you were there at the beginning, you're in the club. That isn't a decentralized solution. So what's the governance mechanism to allow that structure to change? The members that are able to vote on consensus, the members that are allowed to run a node that has a complete copy of the ledger, which may contain sensitive information, the members that are allowed to submit transactions in, and what rights and access do they have to perform those activities. So the other point about this is having a set of processes or tools that are set in stone at the beginning and cannot change simply will not work in this space. We talked about how fast things were evolving this morning. Well, think about what it takes to get to a POC. You want to rapidly just get there with a group of people that have the commitment and the drive to make this a success. A group of organizations that want to get together and make rapid progress are going to put the investment in. And actually, some of the governance may get in the way. But actually, when you get to a pilot stage where you've built that critical mass of engagement, suddenly the IT organizations are going to get in there and say, well, just a minute, everything that I run, I am audited on it conforming to my IT policies, and just a minute, everybody else's IT policies are slightly different to mine. Just a minute, we've got to do this sort of shared IT thing now. It's not just me deploying IT in my data center for my engineers. This is suddenly, I care about your IT conforming to the same standards of my IT for a whole bunch of this stuff. And just at pilot stage, when you know who the participants are, you're just trying to get the first real world transactions, the money or the goods or the services flowing through the system, you have to have got past that kind of barrier of each of the IT organizations being comfortable with the solution. And that's actually where the homogeneity of the environment can help, where actually the consistency can help in some way to just get everybody through a common set of goals, because at least you know if it conforms to your IT practices, then everybody else is doing the same thing as you to a certain extent. And of course, when you get to production, it's about capitalizing on success and growing. There's no point in having one of these decentralized systems unless you're able to grow to the kind of scale that you want to. Maybe it's in the hundreds of organizations, maybe it's in the thousands of organizations, maybe it's in the tens of thousands of organizations. You're going to have that business goal at the beginning. So thinking about how to evolve all of the processes and the tools as you go through, or at least being prepared, knowing you're going to have to evolve those tools and processes, is a core part of this. And actually decoupling the idea of this is the technology from this is the organization and the legal framework that we're running within is actually part of that. But it isn't just all about running a blockchain. It's about the business group of organizations that are getting together and the processes and the evolution of that. So that's the shared workflows. Now, I finally get to talk technology a little bit. The chain is a surprisingly small aspect of the technology involved in these consortia. In every one of the cases that I've come across, it's been a small fraction of the engineering effort. The chain itself. That ledger that's immutable and visible to everybody. Because actually data is usually governed in a way that means there's a tiny fraction of data that can be considered immutable and available to everybody. I mean, just in Europe, we think about the right to forget. Well, anything that's written to a public ledger that is immutable cannot be erased. So what we see is that when you look at the decentralized solution, the blockchain is the foundation, but it's not where most of the activity happens. And common components that we see across the majority in some form of consortia have something at every one of these layers. At the bottom, there's got to be some kind of shared identity registry, because otherwise it's not a permissioned network. If you don't have an idea of being able to know who you're participating with, then it's not a permissioned network, because you have to have identity. But we see a lot of the data is held off-chain. Maybe something like a P2P file system, maybe something more sophisticated, but fundamentally there's going to be a lot of data that's just too big to fit on the chain, or too sensitive to fit on the chain, or that needs to be deleted at some point in the future, and there needs to be a mechanism to have that data available. We have the chain, of course. It's got to be there. But in many transactions, what we actually see gets written to the chain is some hash sent by an anonymously submitted transaction using a one-time generated address that is a hash of a transaction that happened off of the chain, where every piece of data has been obfuscated, so that if the participants wanted to choose to go and use the chain to prove that it happened, they could. But actually nobody could observe the chain and see what was happening. Now, that's not true in every scenario. I don't want to say that that's the only way that blockchain's being used. There are many awesome cases where we're seeing sharing of data in high volume. But actually, a lot of enterprise use cases, just playing back what I've seen, are actually based on writing a vanishingly small amount of data to the chain. Vanishingly small. You move up the layer, and of course, if you're not writing the data to the chain, but you want it to be a blockchain solution, you probably want some kind of agreed private transaction state that you have some evidence on the chain that you've sent that data to others. Hopefully, you even have some evidence of the execution of what happened with that. But it's bi-party or it's multi-party, a subset of the people who are involved in the overall consortium. We had a transaction and we agree on the terms, and here's our agreement. The data that's shared in that, you may want to do in a blockchain kind of way. You're most certainly going to want to store that privately. So we see these sort of rich query data stores with permissioning, maybe channels at this layer, maybe dedicated to on-chain privacy solutions. We talked about Quorum earlier. At this layer, where people can feel like they're doing blockchain, but really still have a lot of privacy over what they're doing. And then the next layer up, it's surprisingly always there, which is being a member of this consortium gives you access to a private messaging bus, which is completely off-chain. It's maybe just a messaging technology, that good old MQ messaging that I talked about earlier, Kafka, some mechanism to share high volumes of data one-to-one, end-to-end encrypted with a party that's part of the consortium, governed by the same legal agreements over data sharing that are part of the consortium. But maybe this is, maybe it's a passport scan, right? It's large data. There's significant controls on how it's distributed and accessed and where it can go and which countries it can go to. But it needs to be shared inside of the consortium. So there still needs to be connectivity that isn't the chain inside of the consortium. And then that sort of outer bound is that actually then even submitting stuff into the chain, there's a lot of consortium management that's needed in terms of policies and standards on how people are submitting transactions, maybe what key management systems are being used and available, some common standards on how people are managing their keys, maybe anonymity tooling to submit transactions in. So of that stack, maybe the blockchain engineering was 20 or 30%. But the solution is the whole. So that's something I think that's certainly been a big learning for me as we've been going through, and we're certainly evolving based on this fact. Then you look at the pieces that actually are going to get deployed individually and completely privately to each one and differently to each one of the participants. And it's actually worth thinking about the engineering in a kind of microservices way. And I feel it's a bit of a trick. I managed to get microservices and services-oriented architecture onto the same slide, which is they usually aren't compatible. But the idea is that actually you're going to have some kind of centralized cross-funded IT organization that's building infrastructure. It may not just be the shared infrastructure. In fact, it usually isn't. There's usually things like the system that connects the end user identity login to the LDAP system of the system of record. Well, everyone's going to need one of those. Let's standardize that. Everyone's going to customize it differently, but let's at least have that as a standard. There's how we're going to manage our keys. What integration tooling are we going to use? How are we going to submit transactions in and out? These are reusable components. They're usually very modern components. They're usually going to be Dockerized and need to be run in a sort of cross-machine, highly available way. New skills, new practices for most traditional IT organizations. Having some way to share common practices, share common tooling, provide a little bit of consistency is really helpful. So almost every consortium that I've looked at haven't gone completely, well, everyone builds their own app. They've gone, everyone customizes their own app, customizes it to their business processes, but probably there are going to be some shared components, collaborative open source, centralized distribution and versioning on those components as well. So then, moving on, we get to, okay, so we've built this thing. We've got a group of us that maybe hopefully we're in the hundreds as some of the solutions that are out there today have got to. We've built an island. We've built an island. How do we meaningfully connect the logic inside of this island? We've got our fantastic smart contracts that we're very proud of. They enforce business logic to do with things in the real world. How do I connect this island to the real world? The most practical thing that you can do today, very straightforwardly, and most implementations are looking at, is some kind of oracle to suck data in that logic can use from the outside world. So we're seeing a majority of consortia looking at ways to get something from the outside world in to be used as part of smart contract logic, if they're doing logic on the chain rather than just using it as a ledger. And there are cases where the chain, all it is just hashes of stuff that happened off-chain. But when you're doing something on-chain, if you want it to be smart business logic, it usually has to have context. You know, doesn't just need to be the price of Bitcoin, right? This could be real world meaningful data that is needed in order to do exchange or green contract terms from the outside world. And there's different ways that you can do that. You can bridge to another blockchain. You can just have one trusted party submit, I don't know, the price of oil regularly comes from the regulator, submits that in, they're a trusted party, a member of the consortium, they're given the trust to do that. Or you can have a decentralized approach to oracles, and there's tools out there like Chainlink and others that are evolving ways to do decentralized oracles, where all of the members of the consortium can submit their own data, a little bit like LIBOR or other sort of group decided items. Everyone can submit it, but there can be some validation measure that ensures that there's consistency on the result when it's queried. But the idea here is not to end there, and we already see some of these islands joining together. There are in the list before, there are consortia which are collaborating in a similar space and looking at already creating meaningful execution bridges between islands of execution, between public chains and permission chains, and very commonly between two permission chains. Now, there is no magic bullets bridging technology today. If you look at asset transfer, it's a tough nut to crack. The most common solution is to use some kind of escrow where actually you trust an individual party to hold something in escrow between two items if you want to, between two environments if you want to transfer. There are some interesting cryptographic time-based escrow systems there for asset transfer, but it's an evolving space. In terms of moving data backwards and forwards, there's lots of technologies that you can build upon, but usually these are custom links. So this is something where it's a case of thinking for your particular solution, what bridges do you need? And actually, if you're building a platform that it could be used for lots of different solutions, those solutions are probably going to need their own bridges for their own data. But this is an area that we expect to grow very significantly through the next year. As these consortia form and are really starting to be meaningful marketplaces for transactions, more of these bridges are going to form, and hopefully some standardization on how you build a bridge for common use cases. So I'm an engineer, practical sort. Making stuff happen is hard. And in this game, it seems that progress is critical. We talked about where the balance should or shouldn't be between correctness and speed earlier. It's unlikely that any project in the blockchain space is not going to have some form of time pressure on it. And if you take a set of rigorous enterprise organizations with 50 years of standards and compliance practice, maybe 100 years in many cases, and you say, all act independently, the chance of that set converging is very low. So the trick we've seen with these enterprise projects is to find the balance between the consistency and speed of governance, and that's the interesting thing of having governance on the same side of this as speed, of almost mandating at a consortia level everything happens this way, with enough of the decentralization, enough of the autonomy that this isn't just another database. And I really do think, as was mentioned earlier, that Upper said earlier, that we should always ask ourselves the question with these projects of why is it blockchain? What makes this blockchain? Why isn't it just another centralized database? And it's important to ask yourself that as you go through the projects. But it's also important to say, well, we could just drink the Kool-Aid of blockchain and say this is all crypto-anarchy and let's just see what happens. But without a little bit of guidance and some governance, it's unlikely anything will happen, and that those meaningful business results that you want to achieve will come out the end. And back to that point that I mentioned earlier, that means that you do need to think about this central pool of resource that's part of the consortium that can be called upon by all consortium members. Whether that's there's a center of excellency that every participant contributes one human being to, whether that's we're actually going to create a separate legal entity and staff and fund it with a bunch of exceptionally talented engineers and business leaders who are going to drive this forwards, or some other structure. It really is so different to anything that's been done before, that if you don't have some core place that people can go to find out the answers to their questions, to consult on the answer to questions, it's very unlikely that they'll just be able to come up with a solution themselves. So it's been a pattern of every blockchain solution that I've seen, that there is this sort of central pool of skill and talent there, just trying to move things along and ungrease the wheels and move things forwards. And the reality is adopting a lot of commonality. Certainly, when you look at the first early phases, and it's interesting for my project in Kaleido, we looked at what people really needed, and where should we invest first to give people what they needed. And it's interesting that we've ended up with a managed solution here that feels a little bit at odds with what people might want in a decentralized nature. Surely everybody just wants to run their own stuff, and everybody does. And everybody will go in with this view of, we know how to do IT, we've done it for all of these years. It is worth bearing in mind, and we've seen consortia learn through experience, it's very hard to get started that way. It's very hard to get started that way. We expect to see all the consortia we're working with evolve to the point where they do have completely separately executing environments for being completely isolated in how they're being run for certainly a number of the validators of the environments and consensus forming entities. But actually none of those projects would have got to where they were today if that's where they'd have started. So that's a really interesting aspect that we've found as we've been going through. So I promise I'll wrap up with the presentation and let you guys all ask lots of questions next. Didn't just leave it with some thoughts on where the foundations are, where the starting points are, and I don't actually think there's a technical item on this board really, because actually these projects start with the people, with the organizations, with that consensus of mission, and actually getting the permissioning right, understanding what it means to be a member, what the roles are, what the mechanisms to grow and evolve the consortium are. Actually working on beyond the POC stage, you can get past the POC stage with less of this, but beyond the POC stage, how do we trust each other's IT organizations enough to do this shared IT thing together and all individually get past our own auditors and our own jurisdictions to actually be able to call this a production system. And then to also have the legal terms and conditions that mean that this is going to deliver on the promise that it had, such as we're going to be able to use this blockchain solution as an immutable ledger to prove that things happened. Well, if when it actually gets to court, there's been no thinking of how will we use the evidence that exists on the blockchain as part of a proof that some transaction really did go the way that it did, if there's no thought to that framework, to the meeting between the technology and the business execution that's happening, then it's very unlikely that actually that ledger is going to be used for the purpose that you hoped it would be to begin with, and everyone's going to fall back to the pen and paper that they did before. So I'm going to stop talking at that point. Hopefully some of that reflection on what we've seen in the markets in enterprise consortia has been useful for you. Are there questions, disagreements, things I've completely missed that you think we should discuss? Jesus.
No, me personally, I think this is the best presentation on the subject that I have seen, ever. Because I was feeling the pain. Or I noticed that you felt my pain, okay? And that's a starting point. I was expecting that you give the solutions at the end. But, okay, we have to work a little bit more.
So I think the interesting thing about the solutions is that there are consortia making real progress. Real, tangible, valuable progress. And we see it day in, day out. And I think the things that are really helping are consistency of purpose and consistency of execution from the technology layer through to the business layer. You can have that shared purpose and shared vision and actually agree, do more agreeing than disagreeing on technology choices, on how are we going to regulate this thing, how are we going to, who's going to install what version are we going to be on. The practical day-to-day, the faster things go and the quicker you get to something that you can build upon and over time become much, much more self-managing.
And not alone. And I mean, we all have to participate on this and collaborate because this is a very, very difficult thing to achieve. At least we feel we are not alone.
Peter, thanks. I just want to go back to you talking about the bridges between consortia, because I find that very interesting. And you made it clear that there's no technical standard for that. That's fine. But I was curious, what's going on, on a governance level between consortia? And are people talking to each other directly, or do you start talking about meta-governance kind of things? You know what I mean?
So we see, I'm not going to talk about specifics here today, but we do see individual consortia discussing practically testing with each other interoperability. We see that happening. If you think about, there's often multiple sides of transactions that happen in the real world. There's maybe movement of goods and services and financing. The entities that exist to build the consortia for those two things may be very separate and want to run in their own space and run on their own schedules and have to solve very different solutions. But actually, if those two things aren't joined together, then you can't actually have an end-to-end solution. So we are seeing very practical approaches where transactions are flowing through multiple consortia to execute end-to-end. We see it actually happening, getting very close to sort of production scenarios for this. What I would say is those bridges are bespoke, and at the moment there's usually, I can't think of an example where there isn't a point where you end up trusting one person. Completely decentralized bridges, I think there is a lot of really interesting open work happening in the public space. With proofs. You can read in some of the paper that was shared earlier, some of the interesting proofs that are happening with cryptographic time-based locking of assets in between as they're transferred through. But my experience is the most practical real-world ones happening in the enterprise space are, here's a bridge. There's maybe the regulator or maybe the consortium entity is trusted to run that bridge, and we'll try and make it as a trusted executor role as opposed to having control over the transactions. But without trusted execution environments and without some of these more sophisticated cryptographic approaches, there's usually sort of one point of trust. And quite frankly, I think that's a rational and really valuable thing to do, because most of these consortia are building with some form of real trust. And actually just saying, look, this is against the ethos, so let's not make progress here, I don't think is valuable. I think actually having those bridges start to execute and perform the interoperability is better than stalling.
Hi, and what governance model do you think are least vulnerable to centralization? Or whether you think governance models should be centralized? Like, let's say, an example, block producers on EOS, which I think are, centralized.
So that's a subjective question with a subjective answer.
No, it was not.
So, what does good mean for governance? One measure of good is how fast things move. Another measure of good is how different a decentralized model is to the models that we have today. For me, the answer is the one that's somewhere in the middle that makes progress and has real impact and change on the way systems of trust exist today. For example, meaning that trust isn't all focused in one entity, and trust can be distributed to a number of individually trusted entities. For example, rather than trusting one central bank, trusting a number of large banks to collaborate with a central bank in a more equal position, I think that's a step forward in governance. But it is still a centralized model if you step back and you say, well, the centralization seems to be with these large banks, and these small banks over here or person on the street doesn't have as much focus. So my observation is that the places that we're seeing most movements towards change are where there's a system that embraces some of the status quo and realizes that regulations don't disappear, that all of that trust and PKI infrastructure and other things used to establish identity and worth exist, but does find a way to allow transactions to happen more transparently and openly, peer-to-peer, between those entities and through those entities. But I do think that's a subjective sort of personal answer rather than this is right or this is wrong, because I honestly don't know what's right or what's wrong in this space.
So Peter, thanks. I have a hard question. Please prepare.
Harder.
So we need to move some public services and other vital services to the blockchain in Europe. What do you recommend in terms of European blockchain infrastructure? Not the technology, right? But how do you recommend that we go about defining and building that infrastructure?
That one definitely wasn't on the prep sheet. So I think maybe if I start from the hard places and work back, I think if you look at trying to allow every single individual to have some sovereign way of performing transactions, and you start there, I think that's a very, very hard place to start. I think something that allows a transparency and equity between organizations, particularly where maybe there's a lack of trust in the public sphere. I think you can get a lot of value out of looking at, for example, financial regulators might be a really interesting space where you see the trust of those is reduced in the public's eyes. But actually there's a lot of systems of governance and an organization in that space to make real change. And there's also probably some data that you can find that can easily be put on the blockchain, which maybe if you started with, I don't know, police forces collaborating, I can imagine it's extremely hard to find any data that you'd be willing to put on the blockchain when you look at those police forces collaborating. But if you can find something that the participants, such as the regulators across countries in Europe, might get value out of, because they can demonstrate the transparency to their end users, they're motivated, and they've got the skills and background to actually execute the IT side of things. I think that's where the least friction might be to get some quick wins.
Is there any other question here? We are going to take one more. Sure.
Sorry.
Thank you. Mine is much more down to earth. So yeah, I agreed with that. This was a very, very good presentation, very complete. My question is about the architecture, which is more technical. We don't know where we're going. Things are changing. Technology is changing. So there are different approaches. Once if you select Ethereum, for example, you're sort of bound to that. You've got the EVM. You cannot migrate easily. There are now new platforms where the blockchain component is more of a middle, just a layer on which you can build independently. So what's your opinion on that? I'm trying to have a kind of modular approach, especially for big projects.
So I very much support, and certainly in Kaleido we think very much about that kind of modular approach. I guess we see the chain as just one of those components, which is maybe the point here of this slide is that actually choosing that DLT layer is one of a number of choices that need to be made. I will come directly to the question of, well, okay, if I choose something like Ethereum, which is where Kaleido's chosen to begin, that Ethereum model, what does a choice now mean? When we started the venture that I'm working on now, chose Ethereum for a very specific reason. And that was about the community and the skills that exist to actually write the shared code, which in so many examples is a couple of hundred lines of shared code. But the potential for side effects that mean that it can't be run deterministically, or exploits that mean you can end up with something that you didn't expect to happening, they're numerous, and actually it takes skill and experience and auditing to get that code right. So when you get down to the smart contract code that's running on the chain, it's very expensive to build. It's probably going to have gone through multiple rounds of reviews for every participant. It's almost certain to have gone through some sort of external audit as well. yes, I agree you'll be very invested in that code. I don't think you'd be any less invested in it if it had been written in Node.js versus Solidity versus something else. I think you're going to be very invested in that piece of smart contract code. And probably when it comes to the next version of that piece of the overall system, you're probably not going to try and migrate what you had before. You're probably going to be looking at, here's the next version. And I would not be surprised to see a big difference between the technology implementation and stack that I see people deploying today and that same consortium, what they're executing in some number of months or years' time. I don't think we're talking about, with the rate of evolution of the technology, we're talking about a set of components which are going to stay static for a very, very long period of time. I think evolution is actually embracing evolution is key to this, and having the framework that means that you can, because the business logic layer, it's going to have so much more business logic than what's on the chain. The point at which you want to say, here's the defined interface, hopefully through some kind of standardized external API, not direct smart contract execution with JSON RPC onto Ethereum, but here's my API for my smart contract. Behind that is some common DLT executed bit of code that runs on some chain, Fabric, Ethereum, Corda, etc. That you've got that, do this business purpose. I think being able to swap that out in the future is probably something that everyone's going to have to do at some stage. Definitely evolve it slightly, but potentially even swap it out completely. So I guess I'm going to resist getting deep into the individual technologies. What I would say is we see choice being something that people are going to expect and want as things evolve. When you look at the individual characteristics of all of the chains, each have trust compromises, each have speed or execution compromises, each have privacy or collusion compromises, which are slightly different. I actually right now think which is chosen in a lot of cases, it can be less important than making a choice and making progress. So if you have the skills to execute, the group to execute with, the knowledge base, the trust in the community that surrounds that technology to allow you to get to the next step, for me right now, with where the industry is, that would be what I would choose based on, not a technical evaluation of, well, right now today, the code is going to be different in 3 months' time, of course, but right now today, this one's got a slightly better this than that. Right now, I don't think actually the technology is mature enough for that to be the primary factor. If fundamentally you say, well, I need kind of some sovereign identity solution and it's impossible to do here and I can do it there, brilliant. There's a clear choice factor. But if it's these lower level differences, it doesn't feel to me right now that that's the core criteria to select on.
Okay, so just a comment on this, and then we go back to the very last question.
No, I completely agree with you. And just to give the approach of Alastria is very pragmatic. I mean, we chose Ethereum variant because we had to make the choice 1 year ago, and that was the only feasible from the associates. By the way, there is no one person taking the decision, it's the associates. The Alastria doesn't have resources, are the associates, the members. And then the next one, I see that in the next year, we are going to have at least 2 main nets in production, in parallel. We are not going to move. It's Fabric. If the associates, the working group is successful, okay? But why Fabric? Because there are a number of associates who are going to invest in trying to build a national network based on Fabric. You may think, no, this is impossible. Okay, we will see. But I think this is going to be possible. Why not other technology like, for example, Tendermint and so on? Because we don't want the best algorithm. We want something to advance, to deliver something, okay? And then learn with this, okay? So completely agree.
Thank you.
Thank you. Chiara Mazzone from the European Commission. I fully understand your point of view, but from a public organization point of view, what would you say, which messages should you be sending to the market to help you build this infrastructure? Which level of details should be given at the first stage? And how could you ensure that this infrastructure is built and maintained? And which kind of contractual agreement would you set up with these developers, maintainers? Lots of questions.
So I will try and give you my best engineer's answer to that question. So let me tell you what I observe in terms of the market engagement. Who is collaborating and what is the business value? That's the message. Blockchain is, and it's blockchain, and this is why it's blockchain. I think that's the depth at which people are engaging and seeing huge amounts of value. As you drop down the stack, there will be much more detailed engagement and probing on exactly what this project is and what it's going to be. But the real market capture is going to be in which organizations are collaborating and how's this collaboration going to be different to what happened before. How are systems going to be better? How are they going to be faster? How are they going to be more transparent than they were before? Because it's blockchain. From a marketing perspective, that's what I've seen be very successful with a number of announcements that have gone recently. And I really do think that that's what, where the value is. I think if you lead from a technology perspective on an announcement, it may be interpreted that there's not actually a fundamental change that's happening.
I think you might have misunderstood. Did he understand? Maybe you want to clarify your question, Chiara? I'm not sure that he answered the question.
I think on the first part, on the which kind of messages should be given, yes, it's like where's the business value is and why people are willing to do this and why blockchain is the nice choice. I'm not sure about the, let's call it contractual agreement that you should be having. That's my question of the related to the public organization. You know, you're managing public money, so you generally do grants or you do procurements, and finally you get one service offered and you are binded or you are collaborating with that service provider, and that's all. Is there any other way of mobilizing the community towards your goal and still being responsible with this public money? I think that would be my reformulation of question.
But so, can you, maybe you can clarify, so in what way is so you're asking about how so government agencies should contract with providers of blockchain infrastructure? And if you are, in what way is it different from buying an email server or a storage server?
Exactly. I do understand that a private organization want to contract with Tendermint or with not contracting with Ethereum or taking the open source code. It's a bit different when you're a public organization, or am I wrong?
So I think
wrong in this sector.
Every one of these that I've seen happen so far has had an aspect of some centralized funding that's needed to bootstrap the whole thing. And in a kind of in a private sector environment, that usually means setting up a separate legal entity, funding that separate legal entity. But there's a split then between the contractual agreement that exists in forming that organization, and then the contractual agreement that's signed by a participating organization to join the consortia. And a lot of the time, the contractual agreement actually joining the consortia is a lot about responsibility for keeping their nodes running in the environment in order to maintain the whole thing executing as a whole. It's about the data integrity and privacy of that data. And it's about a significant amount of ongoing investment that's needed beyond the bootstrapping by that separate entity. So it's a split funding model. And I know that's really hard, but that that is what's happening in the private sector, is that there is some centralized funding, but then that's only a small part compared to what's actually an ongoing investment from the participating organizations, IT organizations.
What about the technology providers?
So from the technology providers' perspective, a lot of the time, if there is a sort of central organization set up, that central organization will choose to contract with a technology provider. Now, an interesting model, and one we've embraced in what we're building with Kaleido, is a decentralized funding model where there may be some centralized choice in terms of a technology provider for services. We talked about skills earlier, and skills has got to be solved as well. But just from services perspective, actually saying, well, okay, we're going to agree as a consortium that we're going to use this kind of technology. Here's a menu of options. You pay directly, you are responsible for your own IT infrastructure. Here's the options that you can choose. Here's the managed node version. Here's the self-managed node version in this cloud. Here's the, well, if you want to go all the way to the cost of, if you're running this completely independently, here's the menu of options that you can take. This is what it's going to cost you to take that menu of options, as opposed to having it, well, here's a centralized funded organization, and you're kind of cross-funding that technology provider going to the center. Right now today, I think maybe for convenience purposes, a lot of them are forming with that sort of funding of technology providers from the centrally funded organization. But I think going forwards, we certainly, in Kaleido, we certainly expect there to be a strong move towards that completely decentralized funding model, participants paying their own way directly, having a menu of options, being able to onboard without needing to have any direct contractual relationship in terms of paying services secondhand to a technology company.
Sure, but if you collaborate in a consortium, you will have a same technology foundation layer, correct? So you're not just end user of something that you decide to use one day, this thing or that thing to do a transaction. If you have a common project, a common use case, which you need to share, let's take supply chains or sharing or whatever kind of documents and data integrity that you want, you need to have a common technology layer.
And that's one of the reasons. And that's one of the reasons why there's such a drive towards using open source in the blockchain space, so that you're not, by choosing an open source technology, it may well be that the most convenient way to get it just straight away is to get through that technology provider. But in reality, you can demonstrate downloading a copy of the ledger, running it yourself using completely open source tools to show that if our IT organization wanted to run it ourselves, we could. If we wanted to outsource it to a different technology provider, we could. And being able to prove that on day one, that's certainly very valuable to us and something we care a lot about. And I think almost certainly in a government entity environment would probably be a must as you went through, being able to prove that there was portability of the solution, that you weren't tied in some indirect way into a technology provider.
You wanted to say something, Jesus? Or?
Again, I agree with you, but it's a little more complex than that, because if you look at your slide, you will see that in order to implement even the use cases, interesting use cases, you have to agree on many, many things, which are common. And then it's not so simple as taking the open source for the blockchain software. It's somebody has to develop the standard for how the identity registry works and interoperates across the countries, for example, okay, in a use case, because I think it's useful to get one or two use cases, okay, like for example, moving documents across countries, okay, and then how do you achieve agreement on all of the different levels which are needed to have something operational. And that's a major thing.
It is, I guess all I'd say, and I really agree with you on that point, is that it doesn't necessarily, it doesn't have to be a technology provider comes in and says, these are your standards. It also doesn't necessarily have to be you need to have an external standard, wait for an external standard to form that you can refer to. It can be a multilateral agreement between the participants of the consortia that says, here's version 1 of X, we've written it down, we've agreed to it, here's a straightforward API that can be replaced behind the scenes. That's enough at this layer. And actually, sometimes that's why it's quite good to have very simple interfaces, very kind of limited, like here's upload document. It's not 500 things you can do with a document. Here's just upload documents, because that's much easier to standardize than the complete document management system.
But I'm still, I'm still a little confused by the question, or I'm trying to understand why. So, perhaps there is a misconception that if you want to use the blockchain, you need to get the Ethereum Foundation to sort of commit to a service level agreement. And I don't think that's their role, because they are just guiding the development of an open technology. And so it appears to me that when government or private entities are purchasing services, there are three main options. One is what Alastria is doing, which is, I think, for all intents and purposes, Alastria is an entity that is responsible for providing a service that relies on a bunch of technologies, right? No, they're not? Okay.
We don't want Alastria to provide services. That's the problem, because the nodes are going to be totally autonomous running different organizations. So I mean, when I said I feel the pain, okay, is that, okay? Because we want, the sentence Alastria is doing, okay, thank you, but I would say Alastria is trying to do, okay, because we don't have the production network. But we have the same problems, okay? And there are some which are not still being solved. Right now, we are really focusing on exactly those problems, okay? Because this is a major thing. Responsibility, assumption of responsibility, sovereign, not just for citizens, but each entity can choose whatever technology provider they want. But we have all, and this is the key thing, to agree on the different layers. Simplification, key thing, okay? You are correctly. But
so let me ask you a specific question to try and thank you for correcting me first. So you have hardwired in your technology a set of permissioning rules, right, that allow some nodes to validate transactions and not other nodes. Now let's imagine that someone manages to hack that technology and give themselves validating status, even though they were not supposed to. Who, in that case, is responsible for that failure?
that's a very good question. Because we are using BFT, we are resistant to just one, okay? So up to 1/3. But if we detect this, we are putting monitoring tools, by the way, developing our monitoring tools to detect these cases. And then, for the moment, because we don't have everything automated, it's going to be a small group, okay, to just raise the hands and vote that this guy should be eliminated. Of course, in the future, we are thinking on autonomous systems just for this, because this can be detected, okay? The nice thing about the blockchain and the BFT protocol is that unless the attacker attacks and gets more than 1/3 at the same time, it's impossible for the attacker to escalate if you detect this and then reject the node. Okay, so it's very robust. But again, this is something we are implementing. Okay, and there are many more questions like this. Okay, because the rule for joining Alastria is that your business is legal. That's the only barrier of entry. Now, who decides that the business is legal? Well, for the moment, this is centralized, but the future is going to be more decentralized. But we are starting from a practical perspective. We are going to learn and then be more decentralized. Right now, we are centralized. Okay.
Yeah, if I can add something on that, after several discussions that we had with regulator also, I mean, the joint responsibility is a concept which is more and more likely to happen. Saying that it's not one person in particular which is responsible for something, for the processing or the breach, let's call it a breach, data breach, but it could be a joint responsibility across several actors. And maybe also what Alex said about the modularity, about blockchain, I think is maybe was also the meaning of the question, and what we try to answer is that today there is no shared features necessarily across different blockchains. I mean, in Ethereum, you make the modelization of a transaction in a specific way. If you want to use other framework, you are stuck to their way of programming, to their sometimes domain-specific language, and so on. And we are still a bit far from something that we can reuse, or some code which is portable from one blockchain to another. And I think this is a difficulty today. You have to make a bet. It's a it's a problem, but it's a bit like that.
I would mention one very interesting space, which we haven't really covered today, and I thought I wanted to mention, which is this boundary between legal responsibility and executing code is a space that there are a number of projects actually trying to tackle. There's open law inside of Consensus, there's the Accord group of organizations looking at executable legal contracts. So that the legal framework is actually in some way a layer above the actual executing code. It's evolving, but I think that is a really interesting space as we go forwards. That may be a level of abstraction beyond this is the Solidity code, but this was the intent of the Solidity code that we all agreed to and our lawyers agreed to. There's maybe a difference then between did the code have a bug in it and did we agree to those terms and conditions?
This is further than what I was saying, but okay.
Okay, I think there was one more question here in the room. I'm bringing some water to Peter because I'm sure we are exhausting him. The discussions are very interesting, so actually we are taking a bit more time than what was originally planned, but I think that we can all agree that the discussion is very interesting right now, so let's not break the flow and maybe ask a couple of more questions and then we'll move on the next discussion.
Hello, I have a question and maybe more to you guys from the European Union, because technology-wise I think we can get it done with public-private partnerships. There are choices to make, but it's possible. But in order to be accepted by the wider public and in each state and country, it's the EU who has to take the lead, the governance too, and to pass a law, to say each country you have 3 years to do the digital ID on sovereign or whatever. But it's the EU, for me, who has to take the lead, not the industry players.
No, correct. It's not easy. Yeah, very briefly with the help of colleagues that are here. So what we are doing with the European Blockchain Partnership, it's that we engage member states across jurisdictions in the European Union since 6 months. They signed this declaration, and what we want to do with them is to have use cases that will be deployed on a European public services blockchain infrastructure that will be ultimately responsible exactly for what you were saying, and we are trying to square the circle in the sense we are trying to get capacity to have this portability from to have the necessary scalability for the use cases that we want to implement. I think it's not a big deal for the moment, to have interoperability and to have this kind of portability between services. And the essence of my question before is that, how can you get there without being stuck with just one, it could be a service provider or just with one solution that you know that today it's working and it's delivering, so you have to start with these solutions, but in 6 months could be very different, and the panorama could be evolving technically and on the governance side, and we don't have the answer, so that's why I'm asking questions. On the legal framework, yes, we also think that if you start having very different solutions on many issues, legal conditions, acceptability of smart contracts, ICOs, it's gonna be a bit messy at some point. So we are doing something and asking the observatory also to ask the community what do you think is the priority in terms of legal conditions and framework conditions in Europe to be a nice place where blockchain can deploy large-scale projects in full security or towards a more legal certainty.
I agree and thank you. I mean, you're of course right too. Maybe on the one main point, I think the digital identity for citizens or for things too. I mean, I think it's a topic which is already well advanced. And is there any concrete implementation for the idea on blockchain or something like this anytime soon?
First concrete things, they are starting already next workshop. So 7th of November, we are organizing a workshop on e-identity and blockchain. Second thing, what we are doing at EU level is that we are linking the regulation that we have, which enable national digital identity trusted providers to be recognized across Europe, and we want to build on the concept of self-sovereign identity plus this capacity of Europe to have certified identity. And we are also pushing member states and together with us at European level to have projects on trying to developing this kind of standard approach for e-identity, for having this e-identity layer. And actually Germany proposed a way forward. Finland is interested, Italy is already reflecting on this. So yes, there's lots of interest, and we all know that it's a priority. It's not the easiest layer or use case, but it's yeah, it's a priority that we are looking at. I don't know if colleagues want to add anything on this. There's also the ISO standardization part on identity.
Yeah, on longer term, of course, the model we would like to follow is to migrate any kind of technological choice that we would make today, because we need to work with something existing towards standardized solutions. That's why we would like to push for standards to emerge as soon as possible.
And yeah, Estonia have already implemented a digital. I'm back here. Sorry. Hi. Yeah. Hi. Yeah, sure. I'm sorry for coming late. My name is Garrett MacDonald. I've been with the Energy Web Foundation since the beginning. We're a consortium for energy companies based on Ethereum as well. Basically, most big European energy companies are on board already, and we're really excited to kind of start engaging with the EU more officially. We're based here in Berlin, just down the street. But yeah, regarding digital identity, Estonia have already implemented a digital identity system where they give you a card with an actual public-private key pair. And it's possible to use an application called Uport, also from Consensus, that's on the Ethereum testnet. Basically, you can use your public-private key pair that has been authenticated with the Estonian government as actually you to sign a message that says, hey, this Ethereum address is mine. And then you now have a Ethereum address that's actually linked to an actual government-proven identity. So the first step is already implemented in there. I haven't seen anybody that's actually created an application that uses that, but all the infrastructure is in place to put that signed message on the Ethereum blockchain and go forward with an application that actually uses a verified identity for a company or a person. So if you want to build something like that, yeah, it's all there.
It's more of a joke, but I think politically I don't think the European Union is going to push every citizen to have a Estonia e-residency card. But yes, we know they are quite active in the partnership on many things.
I would also say the identity space is one of the places that needs standardization and has had a bunch of standardization work happening. Both Uport have contributed to the standards. Other large organizations focused on identity like Sovereign. There is a coming together of a need around just the concept of what does an identifier for identity look like, this DID concept, etc. So actually it's one of the places where there's more formal progress being made towards standards.
Just one remark, because maybe it's I don't know whether I'm just curious to know whether the representative from the European Commission are in agreement with the approach proposed by the recent innovative medicine initiative called the IMI to blockchain-enabled healthcare. And the approach proposed there is basically, I don't know whether this will be successful, but at the end of the day, IMI2 will be spending 18 million euros on this project at the end of, and they propose a project should be addressing the fundamental layer of identity management, of chain storage, security system, and this would be something that is there for any other future application in the healthcare domain. And then they propose, okay, we have identified 3 use cases which are possibly with the most are the more urgent in the field, about medicine counterfeiting and about I can't recall now, clinical trial management, this sort of things. But basically, what they are the bet they are making, asking to do a consortium. I give you 18 million euros, and you do a fundamental stack that will be used by any other consortium project in the future, and then you implement a basic solution for 3 use cases. I don't know whether this is a good way to go, because they are trying to invest money for creating standards, or whether they will spend 80 million euros for nothing at the end of the day. So this is just a question, and whether or not this approach of doing this sort of calls, it's actually successful, or it will be just a questionable way of spending money.
Sorry, just Nadia from Caisse des Dépôts and LabChain. I think before putting Slack on technological platform, we have to work on business pattern and to choose some pattern, some business pattern to work on. Because if we want to go with the infrastructure layer and after build old, I think we will be in the scheme you put in the end of the with the burn. It's a database or a realistic project. It could be dangerous. We talk about scalability first. We talk about business interest and consumer interest. So we much have to find a use case with, if you work on identity on a subject and work on it, and after going to plug other things. But I think if we go from too large purpose, it will be very difficult. And even on cooperation in Europe, I hope 26 countries will work together, but perhaps to work with some of them who are motivated, or some part of the countries on one subject, and after aggregated the others, it would be more easier, because if you demonstrate that you can do something, the other will come with you on board, and it's more easy than trying to make on board everyone, and after working on the subject. Yes, but it's more difficult.
Just to directly answer to you, there are use cases in which, for instance, on tax, on VAT exchanges, which
yes,
everyone is required 28 to work together, and you work 28 together, and we reach agreements that we will be working on this. And there are other use cases. For instance, we have selected this diploma exchange in Europe, in which we see that a certain number of member states are interested, and the idea is to start with the ones that are more advanced, or that are more inclined to have institutions to digitalize diploma and to put them on the blockchain, and then moving forward very pragmatically. There are many things that you touch both, but I'll
and just for Chiara, when you ask for what we can do if we are a public company or a public entity to work with the technology, I think you can build your infrastructure if you have some people in your team to work on. You have to look about the PI of the technology, because when we're talking about Fabric, it's okay, it's open source, perhaps Fabric, but all the bricks around Fabrics are not in open source. So there is a question of governance and dependability of the technology, and to know how to make it develop and maintain. It's an important point. And after, it depends if you are building an infrastructure with others, or if you are building a decentralized, centralized infrastructure, because sometimes and many times it's very centralized infrastructure, to develop service in a decentralized way with many people and many business different linked. For example, if you work on the certification of diploma, you can make interact different parties on a centralized infrastructure, but you can also try to decentralize this infrastructure for different parties. Sometimes not the same, and when we try to put something decentralized, we have sometimes the problem of the regulation. For example, we are launching something on a finance regulation, SFTR, with other banks. And when we go to ISMA the first time to talk about the project, they said we have to know what is the company we will talk with them. They don't can conceive that there is no one entity but many entity, and the problem with the governance was there is many entities. For the moment, it's not allowed, and in the head of the people, it's not concevable.
I wanted to react. I mean, first, indeed, this governance structure and the balance between centralized and decentralized is something which is really a clear issue and a clear aspect on which we have to reflect together. But just to come back to the identity and your suggestion, for instance, but what we heard today, I mean, there is a consensus, and it is on this slide, that the identity is a key building blocks for all the systems that we can have in mind. We are starting in Europe with a topic where we have existing solution regarding a regulatory framework, EIDAS, with a lot of standardization, which are not related to the blockchain itself, but a lot of work has been done in standardization regarding identity. We heard that there is already a solution based on Newport, which is already fantastic and working well. Okay. You mentioned the opportunity now to launch a new project in addition to the tens of projects which probably already test or have developed solutions for identity. So it's clearly an illustration where we need a reconciliation of the different initiatives to know where we are, and if we can go towards this modular approach that was highlighted by our colleagues, simply for the case of the identity. This is, for instance, a clear outcome that we expect from this partnership with the member states, but they will propose that based on what technology providers and the experts that are gathered through this workshop, for instance, can provide. But this is where we expect that after some months we'll end up in a situation where we could say, okay, yes, we can make a choice which may be agnostic to technology, but at least in terms of the way it is structured, the way it is governed, the way it can be used, will make a step towards this modular approach of a blockchain solution. So clearly, identity is a good example about what we want to, a solution to manage the identity, modular solution to manage the identity and to be able to build a blockchain-based solution exploiting this identity is something that we expect to be done in the context of the partnership. But how to go there? And Alastria, we have a solution.
So just to say, we are going to take the few answers here, and then we are going to the next session. Thank you very much for your outstanding participation, but we have to move to the next session, and I hope you will keep this great energy for the working session. Thank you very much.
Just one last remark on what you said just now. So if one of the objectives of the partnership now is, for example, addressing the issue of identity, and if, as the caller was mentioning now, IMI2 will do a total, complete, and separate effort to create an identity system for the healthcare domain, how these two initiatives will come together, and so this is.
The picture is that you have funding from Europe, Commission, Parliament, Council, that goes into research. It's called Horizon 2020. Then we have money. For instance, we are thinking of targeting it to developing identity framework that could be linkable to blockchains. Yes. Then you have initiatives, which are private-public initiatives, like the IMI, so Innovative Medicine Initiative, which issue calls, which goes happily in the same direction that we want to do. Yeah, and it's indeed, we are of course aware of this call. It's indeed, I'm not sure you need an identity layer for health. I think you need an identity layer. And then you have application in healthcare, in supply chain, in the education and diplomas. And then of course we are bridging this funding and these results towards the same goal. Yeah. So please participate.
There are many more examples as well of research and innovation projects that are, I mean, like Decode project or My Health, My Data, etc. Okay. All right. Very good.
we don't have the monopole of the blockchain thing, so nous n'avons pas le monopole de la blockchain.
Let me give you some experience on Alaska. When we started in Alaska, we wanted to just develop the platform, and then we soon realized that we needed the identity. And then we said, okay, EIDAS is fantastic and so on. And then we soon realized that EIDAS was fantastic, okay, but with a centralized model, okay, of a third party. So we said, okay, we cannot be that, but let's try to apply this to the blockchain. And then we soon realized that we needed something like a mixed model. But in any case, we are implementing a self-sovereign identity model in Alastria, inspired in EIDAS, trying to be as compatible as possible, so expecting standardization, we are going to participate in standards and so on, because we want this to be global, not ours, okay? But we just started walking, okay? Because in order to learn, you have to do, instead of just with PowerPoints. And then the idea is that we have is that at the end, we even put in our implementation, most is off-chain, so I like the word of how, I don't remember what you said, okay, but that was, I tried to copy. Okay, in any case, the identity is mostly off-chain, okay, but you use blockchain for what blockchain can provide, okay, which is, looks like little, but is a lot, okay. But then we implemented the EIDAS levels, because this is how it should be, okay. But then it should be a standard. We agree. And by the way, we are very stupid, okay, because we didn't request any funding or whatever, but we are going to do so.
I'm just going to steal it back just for a second. Awesome to see the conversation here. I thought your point that this is about, when you come to identity, it's about pinning identity to the blockchain, because people's identity will never be on the blockchain, that's theirs. And every system that I've come across, it's not that your identity is in the blockchain, it's that you have some real-world mechanism to prove your identity, and there's a link. So, sorry for using the wrong term, but yes, absolutely, that's the link. And I think that is a fantastic infrastructure to think about, is what is the mechanism by which somebody digitally proves who they are, by which they can transact with the system that engages with the blockchain. That's a fundamental problem that I know it's definitely going to have to be solved. Well, thank you all for your time today.